Welcome to Cooper Hall for the first in a series of talks on environmental sustainability. I have with me today Juliet Davenport, who's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the company Good Energy. Juliet, welcome.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here today.
So can I ask you, what inspired you to start Good Energy?
So it's probably quite a long story, but I'll try and keep it relatively short. I grew up actually in a very high carbon world. My background was, my father spent a lot of time on the racetrack, and I sort of followed that around as a child. And it wasn't until I went to university and I started studying physics, something I wasn't brilliant at. I slightly got distracted by many other things at university. But in my third year, I got to study atmospheric physics. And it was there that I suddenly started to understand the science of climate change. We had also had the big storm in 1987 where Michael Fish had misrepresented the data and got the forecast wrong. And that really was the beginning of my sort of awakening, I guess, around climate change. I then went on a very wiggly path, I have to say, before I started Good Energy. I think I worked in sports PR for a while. I was a physics teacher for a bit. I even did a bit of hospital radio at one point.
Okay.
But I eventually ended up sort of working in renewables, doing some work around renewable energy policy. And I ended up at a conference in Greece and met a German entrepreneur where we kind of came up with the idea of Good Energy together.
So was it a business enterprise that you saw an opening for, or was it because you were committed to environmental projects?
I think it was really, I'd always tried to find a space for climate change in business. I think I did a little bit of academia and decided that wasn't really for me. I worked a little bit in government, and government's really important, but it's very slow. And I think business was very appealing because essentially if you can sell something to a consumer, you have freedom, you have huge creativity in business. And business is a real engine of change. So business seemed like an obvious place to be. And it also, the other side of that is I wanted to empower consumers to be part of a climate change response, rather than just being blamed for being the reason why climate change happened.
So you think that sort of industrial perspective could do more in a sense for changing the narrative of climate change, rather than through political means?
Yeah, I mean, there was, I went to a conference once in Oxford called Tipping Point, which is a really interesting conglomerate of people in business, people from the arts, people from science, and people from government. And we started this conference when everybody got asked to go and stand in a corner of which part of society did we think was going to make the biggest change. And what was fascinating about it is everybody else stood in everybody else's corner. Nobody stood in their own corner. So the artist stood in the scientist's corner, the scientist stood in the artist's corner, and the government stood somewhere else normally. But for me, you need all of them to work together to really make something change. And at that point, government was very involved. Industry in terms of big tech was very involved, but consumer was not involved. Retail was not involved at all. And so it felt like actually if you connected those pieces really well together, then you would be able to move much faster.
Right, yeah. I mean, so to the sort of beginner in a sense, can you explain why the planet survived for millions of years with natural carbon dioxide emissions, and things like volcanoes have happened and natural disasters. But now we're facing climate change as a consequence of carbon emissions from human use of energy. Is it simply a matter of our human action since the Industrial Revolution, or is this something that happens naturally anyway?
So there's a carbon cycle where you see carbon being emitted and then being sunk back into many different sort of carbon sinks, whether it's the soil, whether it's the oceans, whether it's forestry, that you then sink the carbon back and hold it out of the atmosphere. So you get this balance between that. What we've done is we've taken a lot of those carbon sinks, like fossil resources, like peat resources, like forestry, and we've removed them. And so we've put that carbon back into the atmosphere at a pace that's never been seen before. And that's what we're accelerating. And so the carbon cycle can't cope with that. It can't then sink that carbon back down quick enough to stop a carbon accumulating in the atmosphere.
How far away are we from being able to activate carbon capture then? Is that something you're interested in?
So carbon capture and storage is a technology. There's a lot of innovation and research work going on that. In terms of actually where it is in its cycle, it's very early stage at the moment. So the two things that you've got and the challenge of it is price and then quantity. How effective can it be and at what scale can it be effective? Because you then have to put that carbon somewhere. You can't just it's not just about a technology that runs.
It solidifies, doesn't it?
Yes, but you've then got to you've either got to inject it into the seabed or you've got to store it somewhere that's safe, remember. So it's got to live there for thousands of years, otherwise you just create the same problem again.
Can you build anything with it? Can you? I mean, it's like rock, isn't it? So can you actually reuse it?
It depends. So it's not always solidified to absolute solid. It can be liquefied as well. So most of the technologies I understand are going to be liquefied. And so you'll pump it into something like a gas or oil gas field offshore. You can make it into rock, and there's talk about making it into diamonds, but that's very specific and very small scale. The larger scale is going to probably be on a liquefied basis.
Okay, so we can't be dependent upon carbon capture.
No.
So how should we generate our energy going forward? We've got wind, solar and hydro. What about biofuels?
So biofuels are really interesting. If you think about the potential for energy, let's just think about the UK because it's fairly straightforward and it's quite good for sort of developed countries. So you've got, say, 30% of our energy needs are electricity, 30% are about transport, and 30% about heating our homes and our businesses. So on electricity, you've got things like wind power and solar power are very effective from a renewables point of view. You've got some hydro, but it's a smaller potential. And then you've got the marine technologies, which again are quite nascent, like the carbon capture and storage. So you've got those technologies, and in the UK, last year we were about nearly 40% of our electricity comes from renewable energy. We've done a pretty good job of accelerating that. And we can see that offshore wind potentially is going to add significantly that, and solar going forwards, and then hopefully marine will catch up in the end. So electricity is not too bad. What's interesting on heating is probably our biggest challenge. Nearly 85% of the homes in the UK are connected to the gas grid.
Yeah.
So to decarbonise that is going to be a real challenge. And we'll probably do that partially through electricity, but actually using a sustainable biomass, one that's locally grown, that's locally sourced and locally regrown for heating is probably a good conversion, because you get about 80% conversion from the actual energy in the wood to the energy that you produce into the house. What you can do is you can actually use biomass in electricity production as well. I mean, my personal view on that is that you have to be really careful about sustainability of it. You have to think about where it's come from, what it was being used for, and how far you've had to transport it, because quite often when you're generating electricity, you're putting it in a large power station. You're having to move it, significant differences. And we've got power stations in the UK that bring it over from Canada.
Yeah.
And at that point, it feels like sustainability falls over.
But I mean, it's producing carbon anyway, isn't it?
It is, but it's got to. So this comes back to the time scale of the carbon sink.
Right.
So if you can regrow it within the life cycle, within our lifespan, then it was qualified as being renewable, because it's all about how much do you put up and then how much do you sink back down. I noticed that Good Energy also offers gas as well. Yes.
And that's from what source?
So we have 10% comes from biogas, which is normally waste food, waste products coming, so mainly waste food. And so that's a gas that's produced as a result of waste products decomposing and producing a gas.
Which they would anyway.
Yes.
So you're actually just harnessing what's already there and would be going into the atmosphere and using it. And I mean, I think I read it was about 10% of your gas comes into. So is that likely to expand? Is it something?
So what we're looking at the moment, so we're doing a piece of work that looks at what is the potential for biogas in the UK. How much of the future do we think can come, future energy source can come from that? And I reckon it could be between 10 and 20%. We're looking for the... Yeah. And so our view is that we want to create a product that's really future-proof, that looks like the future.
Yeah.
Because you then got to say, okay, so are we going to produce some of our gas from hydrogen, and I think there will be hydrogen in the gas mix at some point. And then are you going to electrify the rest of the heating potential? So that's what we're looking at the moment, is what does that transformation matrix look like going forwards? And how are we going to plot all these different technologies?
Is it using hydrogen, can the existing technology, household technology, sustain that?
I think it's up to about 10% mix.
Right.
So you can put it into the existing gas mix and mix it up. And you can use existing technology at the end.
Yeah.
It's when you start to go above those concentrations that you have to start changing the end use.
Right. Okay. How do you feel about nuclear energy then, which doesn't give out carbon emissions?
So it's really interesting. When I did an internship in the European Commission working on energy policy, and when I arrived, I was passionate about climate change, and I was agnostic about technology. I was interested in all technologies and how they deployed. And it wasn't until I left there, having worked on security supply, looked at a lot of the data that was coming out of Europe on nuclear, that I actually, basically, from my point of view, from a pure economics point of view, nuclear doesn't really stack up. It's a big lever that governments like. It makes them feel confident about the future. But it's only governments who have a lot of money who can afford nuclear. The nuclear waste clear-up is hugely expensive. And most of the time, investors will not invest in nuclear without a government underwriting the future costs of the waste disposal. I just think it's too expensive. I also think it's not very flexible. People continually talk about the amount of power it produces and how it produces power. But actually what you need is somebody to take, you can't switch them up and down. So they're not flexible plants at all.
All right.
And so if demand goes down, you have too much power and you have to sell it somewhere else.
Right.
And if demand goes up, you can't turn it up as well.
And we've got the spectre here of, not far from where we are, of Hinkley Point being built by Chinese government construction and EDF running it from France. It seems it's an international business. And I see EDF have recently been describing themselves in advertisements as being the greenest, producing the most green energy of any company.
Yes, there is a debate about that at the moment, and I think there's going to be some redefinitions of what green means. So they count nuclear obviously as green, and they have a bit of solar and a bit of wind as well. Yeah. But I think, the statement that you just made there about the Chinese government and the French government, those are the only people who can really afford to build those kinds of power stations, are governments, because the overall liabilities on nuclear are so huge. Yeah. And the flexibilities and also the timescales in terms of building them. I mean, in the same period that we've been building Hinkley, I can't remember, it was Vincent Riveras, who was the CEO of EDF at the time, said that we were going to be eating our Christmas dinner off Hinkley Point. I think it was in the 90s, maybe it was 2000, I can't remember. But obviously we're still now here in 2020 and it's not, not complete. The reactor they're building has never actually, am I right in thinking it's never actually worked elsewhere? No, it was meant to be a blueprint, it was meant to be in Flamanville it was, and the actual reactor cracked. So the idea was that they would have something that they could reproduce in lots of different places. So and they just haven't managed to deliver that yet. So it could, in theory, be a white elephant? Potentially. Right. Potentially. What about tidal energy? Does that provide some sort of core energy supply? Will that end up replacing coal and gas, which is the ultimate aim, I suppose? Do you see that as being... Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting with tidal, I think there are a couple of tidal technologies. There's something called tidal stream, which is like an upside-down wind turbine, where you've got big tidal currents. Yeah. And there's a reasonable potential for that, but there aren't very many places you can put them in the UK. The other one is tidal range, where you, like a lagoon, where you basically, it's almost like a mini dam. It's like a small hydro plant, but in the sea. And then you dam the water and then let it out through a tidal piece. And I think what we've seen is that those technologies have been a bit threatening to the existing technologies, so they've been slightly kept out of the mix to date. Yeah. I mean, I would hope to see those technologies come in. I think we can produce about 10% of our electrical needs from tidal range alone in the UK. Yeah. And it also has some flexibility in it, so you can use it like a pump storage and you can turn it up and turn it down.
Yeah, there are a number of small-scale success stories there, I think, aren't there? And I think the Orkney Islands entirely generate their own renewables. I think, is some of that from tidal, or is it wind?
There used to be, I think there was a wave technology up there called the limpet, which was basically stuck on a rock and it would move in and out of the rock like that. But there's been some tidal, as I said, there's been some tidal stream technologies that have been deployed. There's not been a range at any scale deployed to my knowledge in the UK.
What about geothermal?
So geothermal, we have one of the largest low-grade geothermal supplies in the UK, particularly in the southwest. So if you dig down, I think in Cornwall, the Eden project's looking at doing, is it a 2-kilometre drill, which is going to create a 10 megawatt power station. But then you've got the potential geothermal for heating. So you've got ground source heat pumps and where you're essentially taking heat out of the ground and converting them into heat into people's homes through an electrical process.
It seems like there's a combination of possibilities that we need to look at, and to get them all manoeuvred at the same kind of time in order to solve this problem.
Completely.
Yeah. Can we develop commercially viable ways to store surplus electricity generated in non-peak use times, like big batteries?
Yeah, so I mean, we already have big batteries being developed. It's very difficult to actually commercially develop in the country at the moment, because there aren't the long-term price investment signals right now existing. And it's one of the big debates is the marketplace that was developed for particularly electricity in the UK was developed for fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So it was really developed to deal with large gas power stations and large coal power stations, who all have a fuel cost.
Yeah.
Now, renewables have no fuel cost. So the dispatchability of them means that you'll always want to generate with them, because the big cost is the upfront investment cost, not the running cost. And so battery is an interesting sort of intersection in there. Is to get batteries built, you have to give people long-term price signals, again, because they're expensive technology, but then you run them pretty much for free going forwards.
Yeah.
So that is the big debate at the moment, is how do we create a future marketplace that is fit for this new low-carbon world?
Looking ahead, I mean, electric vehicles are being now, we're becoming on stream more and more as time goes on. I think the Germans have basically banned the internal combustion engine from, is it 2030 or?
Yeah, and we have here as well, 2035.
Yeah. How can we organise sort of electric vehicle charging at non-peak times? Is there an easy way we can move it? Because it seems to me that people are quite reluctant to shift towards electric cars. And I think one of the issues might be how you get them charged. Will they last you to the length of the journey? They're very expensive. Do the batteries need replacing? Are you involved in any way in Good Energy with moving that forward? Do you have sort of charging points and things like that?
So we invested in something called ZapMap, which is probably the premier mapping service for EVs in the UK. So if you want to do a journey in an EV, you take ZapMap, the app, and it will tell you where all the charging points are and what you can how you charge at them. And I think that whole range anxiety piece, being able to have confidence about where you go and where you can charge is a key point. It's a key consumer behaviour change that we need to support. I think in terms of the growth of electric vehicles, I think also the biggest challenge was there were not enough ranges across the different types of vehicles. So you had Tesla come in with some really high-end technology, but you had very little and you had the Leaf at the other side, but you had very little in the middle. Yeah. And what we're seeing now is new car manufacturers coming out with new models all the time. And so there is now going to be a model that suits everybody. So I think you're beginning to solve that consumer problem. The range problem now, we have more charging points in the UK than we have petrol stations. So we're beginning to get through that.
Is that right?
Yes. I mean, they're charging points, so they're not the same as a petrol station.
No, but even so.
Yeah, so we have significant charging points, and the rapids are now beginning to be rolled out significantly. There's a lot of government support to roll that out and make sure that gets rolled out across the UK. And we've got to sort things like interoperability. So can you pay the same way for all the different charging points so it's easy for people to use?
Yeah.
And then can you charge at home, and does that become easy to use as well? So I think all these things are beginning to move. They always will. You'll get your early adopters who are quite happy to deal with the fact it's a bit difficult.
Yeah.
And then you need to make it easy for consumers to come in.
Yeah, okay. So your philosophy is, other than other than providing electricity, it's also enabling people to access it.
Yes, exactly.
Because you see that as part of your future network. Can I haven't asked you a question about you don't just buy it in at Good Energy, do you? You don't just buy the electricity in from others. So you actually have wind farms, is that right?
Yeah, so we own and we develop. We went through a period of developing our own wind farms and solar parks.
Yeah.
So we do have our own technology as well, which is actually really helpful because it means if we want to experiment a little bit, so in terms of the way we trade it or the way we supply it, we can do that on our own sites and then support other people in the same way. So we can play around with what's the best value we can get for those generators, how can we make sure people who want to build in the future can get the best contracts, and then provide that to our customer base.
Yes, when you started, you were presumably dependent upon other people running wind farms.
Yeah, so I always remember when we were trying to set the company up, we had many sort of catch-22 questions. It's like, how do you supply when you have no power? And how do you have a license when you have no company? And we went through all those questions, but we did a tour of the Southwest actually, because there were a lot of sort of entrepreneurs in the Southwest who'd looked at getting into renewables early. And the German colleague and myself basically got in a car and drove around the whole of Southwest going to talk to renewable generators and persuading them to sell our power.
Are there any ecological disadvantages to, I mean, one hears apocryphal stories about windmills, wind turbines, killing off flocks of birds and things like that. Is there an element of that that's in any way true, or is it just apocryphal?
I think, first of all, you never put a wind farm in a flight path. So that was one of the things you always do, is you do a lot of ornithological studies initially to make sure that you're not going to kill anything. There will always be, like any building, I mean, we have a building in Chippenham where our customer services come out of. We kill pigeons every day just by being there. They sort of flatline into things. So I think any obstacle will always kill something. But there is generally the number of birds killed by cats and cars far outweigh what they are by wind turbines.
But this is the questions that people ask, isn't it? If people have determined that they don't want to go down the route themselves of subscribing to Good Energy or one of your competitors in that field, or they don't want to buy an electric car, they always come up with these kind of excuses that and that it costs, the main cost of running a car is actually in the manufacture, and that actually uses up a lot of the, it's more of a carbon footprint in making it. But it strikes me that isn't the way forward. We've got to look towards how we use our power. And accept to some extent. I don't know whether you accept to this extent. To some extent, we are going to have a carbon footprint.
Yes, I mean, I think the other thing is that I'm hoping at some point we will be able to produce cars with zero carbon footprint, because the actual energy that goes into making them will have zero carbon footprint itself. So you'll get to a point where you get rid of that initial carbon footprint from a car. But yes, I think a lot of people are always worried about change. They don't like change, they try and profess it. I have a lot of these conversations with my brother-in-law, normally over lunch, which is about sort of why what the car part, surely it has a bigger impact, or you can never get it charged, or I would never buy one because. And you do have a lot of those conversations, but the answer to that is to continue to look at the data and provide information and carry on the conversation, which is why I've always believed that consumers are so important, because they become part of the conversation and they have that conversation with everybody else. And so the more people you can get involved, the more you can win the argument and the emotional argument as well.
Do you think we're on course to be 100% renewable by 2050?
I think the UK could easily be 100% renewable by 2050. I mean, we have 40% of Europe's wind resource. I mean, we have massive wind resources. And despite the fact, I always remember this, I went to a lunch once with Vince Cable and the rest of the energy industry. And I always remember a spokesperson for British Gas saying that solar wasn't very important and it wasn't very sunny in the UK anyhow. And that was the year before we put 13 gigawatts of solar power onto the electricity grid in the UK. So solar is an important technology for the UK, despite the fact that occasionally it's a bit rainy here.
Yeah.
Wind is an incredibly important technology. I think electricity will be easy. I think heat will be harder.
Yeah. I mean, the technology that exists now is being modified all the time, isn't it? I mean, in terms of wind farms, I think I've seen turbines now that aren't really turbines anymore. They vibrate or something. Is that right?
That could be a vertical turbine.
Well, I don't know.
I'm
not the expert.
Vibrating.
I might be wrong, but I mean,
but they're much
broaden
bigger. They're much. I mean, the size of them in comparison to. So when we first started out, we had a 400 kilowatt turbine. We replaced that with 2 megawatt turbines in one step, and now we're at something like the biggest turbine is a 14 megawatt turbine for one single turbine. So the scale of change in terms of that technology is massive.
And is that the case with solar? Is it getting more sophisticated, the photovoltaic?
At the moment, it's getting much cheaper. I think we'll then see sophistication later.
I think I saw, some maybe in America, they developed roof tiles for houses that were photovoltaic.
Yeah.
It seems crazy to me that we're not using those now.
Yeah. Those are expensive. The reason why we don't tend to use tiles is they're much more expensive than panels. Panels are much cheaper.
Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, there's no reason why you wouldn't put a solar panel on every roof in the UK.
Do you think the building industry is guilty of not pushing this agenda?
I think there's no reason for them to. That doesn't add to the commercial value of their buildings at the moment. So there's no incentive for them. I think you have to make sure you incentivize everybody in the right way to do it.
I mean, is the political will there to do that?
I think that the issue that we have at the moment is that big players have a lot of political clout. So unless you're a relatively big player, so we've now seen wind have a lot of political clout. We've just seen that come through. I hope that we start to see the other technologies move forward as well.
And how resistant do you think that the traditional industries are? I mean, I see Shell, BP coming on line with their new renewable energies and biomass, and I mean, I'm going to ask you the question. What do you think to that?
Yeah. So I think I recently was on a panel with somebody from, I think it was from BP. I think for me, the guy was saying, oh, our shareholders can hold us to account in 10 years' time. And the point is, 10 years' time is too late if we're holding them to account and they haven't delivered what they promised to deliver. So they kind of need to be showing us now how much are they investing in fossil and how much are they investing in renewables, and actually be very transparent about that data, because they're still putting a huge amount into fossil. However, there is a massive amount of pressure on them now. And that's something that all of us can do as individuals. If all of us write to our pension funds or our pension companies who hold our pension funds and say to them, we do not want you investing in fossil, they have to change. And that then takes the investment away from those companies, which reduces their value. And which makes them absolutely do something. So if there are no debt providers and no equity providers into those big organisations, they have to start changing their behaviour.
I mean, a new phrase has come about in recent years called greenwashing.
Yes.
Is that how you describe some of the bigger companies the carbon companies that are trying now to look as if they're being environmentally astute?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of advertising that you see. I mean, it always seems to be at airports, I seem to come across it, where you see these large oil companies basically saying, the future is solar. But potentially they're not actually investing anything in solar. They're just saying the future is this or the future is this. And that's not enough.
The future's in solar, but we're having nothing to do with it.
Not yet, anyhow. Not until somebody forces us to.
Yeah.
And I think this is the big issue, is that people become very complacent because they think, oh, it's okay, they've sorted it. They're big energy companies, they're on it. We're comfortable. And of course, that's what they're trying to do, because they don't want the pressure to have to move faster.
Because it is a problem for a company like yours, isn't it? If you've got competition out there, if somebody could quite understandably sign up with a major oil producing company and say, we will provide you with completely green electricity, and actually they're sort of, they're not falsifying it, they are actually manipulating the system to provide that.
And when we called it out, we've been calling it out for about 3 years now. Shell, when they came into the electricity market in the UK, they weren't 100% renewable overnight like that, which is obviously not possible, because they bought some certificates in the marketplace, which is a very cheap way of showing
It's the
it.
carbon offset certificates.
It's not
is it
carbon offset, actually. They're called renewable certificates.
Yeah.
They are issued with renewable power, but they're not connected to it. So there's the potential to double sell. There's lots of different sort of greenwashing. You can buy them from other countries in Europe who don't have the same regulations.
I find this hard to get my head around this, so I'd like you to explain to me a little bit. These renewable certificates,
Yeah.
you can buy them from people that sort of underspend on their carbon output. Is that how it works?
So no, what you can do, so renewable certificates are issued with renewable production, but they're issued across the whole of Europe.
Right.
Okay, so I could buy some renewable certificates in Poland and use them in the UK and say, this is my green power.
Yeah.
Now, if Poland doesn't have the same regulation as me, I could call it green power in Poland as well.
Yeah.
So I've just double counted that. And actually, if a business buys its power directly from a wind farm, it's buying its power directly from a wind farm. So it's saying, I'm buying the electricity from this wind farm. But it could also sell those green certificates to somebody else. And then that person claims they've got green certificates as well.
Yeah.
So it's not regulated properly.
Yeah, they're upping the appearance of their sustainability.
Yes.
I was interested in a couple of things you said earlier. One was the fact that you were a physics graduate.
Yeah.
Were there many female undergraduates when you first started studying?
Not a lot.
In physics?
So I think it was probably a 10-to-1 ratio, sort of men to women. So yeah, you didn't have many female friends in doing physics, and you kind of grew up. I mean, I actually went to a girls' school originally, so it went from sort of sublime to the ridiculous.
Yeah.
And when I graduated, eventually ending up in the energy sector, it felt very similar. You have energy sector was very dominated by engineers at the time. Engineers, I think, is even worse than physics. I think it's a 12-to-1 ratio in engineering.
Why do you think that is?
I just think actually we don't sell the sciences very well at a young age into schools. I also think we ask people to specialise at the age of almost 14 to decide whether they're an art student or a scientist. My personal background is I had a mother who was an artist and a father who was a scientist. I feel I'm both. I didn't want to be pigeonholed. And our education system pigeonholes us from a really young age.
Did you choose physics with that in mind? Was it a bit of an alternative offering? It was something you thought, I'm going to do physics because that's what I'm not expected to do.
I don't think so. I did it because I genuinely enjoyed it. I mean, physics is incredibly creative, actually. I mean, it has quite a lot of philosophy in it. Some might even say theology, and a lot of science. And it's got this kind of combination. You deal with a lot of things like some of the relativity theorems that seriously we do not really understand. Quantum physics, there are a lot of things we fundamentally don't understand, yet we use these principles and create things out of them. And so for me, physics is this incredibly creative science, but it's never really explained in that way, which I think is a real shame.
So moving on then, you go from being, one of the few female undergraduates on your course, and you then find yourself in the energy business.
Yes.
Where I'm guessing, you were the only woman in the room on other occasions.
Yeah, I mean, there'd quite often be maybe one other woman, but yes, in a room of 20 people, it would normally be me and maybe one other.
And was this a sort of high-powered meetings in political circles?
Yeah, so I sat on the board of the trade body for the energy sector at one point, and we used to go and have ministerial meetings, and all the ministers and the civil servants would all be men. And then you'd have mainly men around the table, maybe one other woman sometimes. And it was fascinating to watch, actually. You kind of see these high-level meetings and different companies taking a different view. And I always remember some of these particular ones, and they were slightly larger than life characters. And the image that always comes to mind is walruses basically fighting on the beach, kind of like.
But did you feel comfortable in that setting?
I think I did. I mean, I grew up on the side of a motor racing circuit, so I kind of was very used to watching men at work and being around men, so they didn't really faze me. I was probably surprised by how different I felt, actually. That was probably the biggest thing, is that every time you spoke or said something, you did feel like the spotlight was on you, for being the only female voice in the room. So that did put a lot of pressure on you, I think.
I mean, did you find it a fairly brutal business where people were usually the analogy of walruses, were they sort of intellectually wrestling with one another in the room? And did you feel comfortable joining in with that, or did you find the strategy was better to sit back and then make your point more pertinently at the right moment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was trying to I was always challenging the status quo, because, I mean, that's one of the reasons I set up Good Energy, was to challenge the status quo. So I was always coming in with a challenge. And so you have to see where you play your challenge card.
Yeah.
And so there were parts of conversations I probably didn't partake in, because you can't say everything all the time.
And you weren't ever sort of looked at and asked to go out and fetch the tea?
No, I wasn't. They were better than that.
They were better than that.
but there was, I mean, there was interesting. There was another physicist who used to sit on one of these boards with me. He would always, every time I said anything, he would try to take it apart intellectually. It's like, oh, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
So the competitive level was there. Definitely.
He felt threatened, presumably.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. You never know with people.
And was that at sort of, we're talking about government level here?
Yeah, it was. It was with ministers and Secretary of States.
Yeah.
I mean, it was fascinating to watch and really interesting to see how they operate at that level.
Right.
And the different tactics, because different people took different approaches.
Yes. And you're moving from, I mean, I think you have an economics background as well, is that right?
I did a master's in economics.
Yeah, so in fact, for you, presumably it wasn't so difficult moving from being a scientist to an economist and being able to adapt your scientific knowledge into the context of business.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very, numeracy helps a huge amount, and economics is a lot of the maths that we did in physics, you do the same in economics.
Yeah.
And then employing that, and I mean, my team probably, I try not to do it as much anymore, because obviously when we first set up, I used to do a lot, I used to do everything as a business. We were sort of 5 people or whatever. You can't get over a good spreadsheet to figure something out. I find spreadsheets in my creative world. It's where you create something and understand the dynamics of it.
Right. Another interesting thing about your background is you worked at the EU, I think.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
So I did an internship in energy policy at the EU, which gave me this huge. It was amazingly powerful, actually, because it gave me this oversight of European energy policy and actually international energy policy. I got to work on an international energy treaty, seeing how the geopolitics of energy came together and which countries wanted to do what. And then you could see where policy had been driven from in each of those countries as well. And then it helped understand the interconnectability, particularly of Europe at a European level, and how it all worked together.
Well, that's an interesting point, because we're now in a situation where we're out of the European Union, and yet we have channels of supply with electricity going backwards and forwards under the sea, I think.
Yes.
Are there going to be interconnectivity issues?
I think they're going to have to figure out how you trade the power between the two, because we've got electricity. You've also got a lot of gas pipelines as well.
Yeah.
Remember, there's a lot of mainland gas that comes off the European mainland into the UK. I mean, any trading agreement is going to have to be agreed at a high level to make sure you can trade power in and out of the country. And at the moment, we've got a relatively limited level of interconnectivity, but we're going to see that increase. There's potential interconnectivity to Norway, which won't be affected by the EU, but you've got a lot more going to the Netherlands and other parts of Northern Europe.
So there's going to be tariffs added onto this, presumably?
Potentially. I mean, it's going to have to, each one will have to be negotiated on an individual level. But to be honest, I think I don't see that as being that complicated. I think we'll cope with that relatively well. it will just be another piece that needs to happen in terms of the negotiation.
So which countries do you think are ahead of the game with regard to renewable energy, sustainables?
So I think it's really interesting. What I always find fascinating about Denmark is Denmark essentially was a fishing country pre the oil crisis of 1973 and 1979. And they made the decision that we're going to move away from oil mentally, and they moved into the wind industry, and they made the wind industry one of the biggest industries in Denmark. They also took Dong, which is Danish oil and gas company, which is the national fossil fuel company, and it's now the biggest offshore wind company in the world.
Was it nationalised?
It's partially owned, publicly owned, partially nationalised.
Yeah.
So it's 50-50 ownership.
So they actually made the decision to move out of unsustainable power into renewables.
Yeah, completely. So I think you look at that's quite an iconic country in terms of that transition. Obviously, Germany went early on solar and in wind, so they've been part of that transformation. I think, though, what we'll see now is the Far East. You'll see. So China has obviously been absolutely key to driving down the price on solar. Yeah. And the question is, what is the UK going to be great at?
Yeah.
That's always been my question. I think we missed out on becoming having a wind industry of our own here, despite the fact that we've got so much resource here.
You said 40%.
40% of Europe's wind resources here in the UK, and we didn't take that opportunity. I'm kind of hoping that we might have a bit more foresight in things like the tidal and the wave industry, because obviously we have a significant amount of that resource here as well in the UK.
I mean, you find that you have to lobby hard to, in political circles, to get your industry taken seriously, or did you have to?
Yeah, and quite often what you had to do is slightly take the industry by surprise. I mean, that was what was so brilliant about the solar revolution, is nobody believed in it. And so it happened overnight, and nobody saw it coming because they thought it was going to be really small, so everybody dismissed it.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it became this massive part of our sort of production of renewables in the summer months. Huge amounts of power was coming from solar. And so that for me, if the industry can see it coming through the front door and they can try and resist it, they will lobby against it.
Yeah.
If they dismiss it as too small, then they forget about it. And that's what happened with solar in the UK. So the incumbents will try and protect. It's worth them spending a huge amount of money from the point of view of political lobbying to maintain the status quo. And I think it was somewhere in the US where the coal industry spent £61 million in 6 months on lobbying to keep one particular part of legislation to prolong the life of coal in the US. Yeah. And that's just one company. The companies in the UK, they have huge political capability.
We're talking on the eve of the American election.
Yes.
And I saw Biden actually saying on TV, denying that he would get rid of fracking, for example. Yeah. Because clearly there's a populist element that suggests that you cannot get rid of carbon fuels altogether, and you've got to develop the carbon industry as well. I got the feeling that he was actually covering up.
Well, I think it's difficult because obviously there's a significant fracking industry now in the US. It supports a significant part economically in those local areas. So if you do want to close it down, you've got to give a viable alternative to it. And of course, until you're in power, you can't really figure some of those things out.
And isn't that the case here as well, in the sense that we got rid of all the coal mines kind of for economic reasons in the 1980s, and but we didn't replace those jobs and those communities with other things. Do you think the sustainable energy market could actually replace jobs? This is what the Democrats are talking about, building real jobs and industries around sustainability.
And I think that's a real potential. So I think we've talked a lot about the electricity industry, but if you look at the heat industry, which is a much more decentralized, sort of localized industry where you need to put implementation into either people's homes or people's businesses. Yeah. You need local skilled workers who are delivering services locally. And so actually it's a much more decentralized approach to
so
skills
you're separating the heat industry from the electricity industry in a way.
Well, there's parts of the electricity industry. So individual solar panels on people's roof, that is a decentralized business as well. But large scale offshore wind is very centralized in kind of the areas where you're going to deploy. Yeah. So you'll have centres of expertise on offshore, which will probably be drawn from the offshore oil industry as well. But what's interesting about some of these heat and the decentralised electricity markets is that they'll need to be across the UK. And so they can be in areas where you've got deprivation from removal of economic activity in those areas.
So in a sense, these two things go hand in hand. If we're going to be energy efficient, we also need to have companies to invest in heat pumps, dual exchange, geothermal, that kind of thing. Yeah, we're going to be looking at that another time.
Yeah, I mean, I think heat is our biggest headache right now. It's so easy to switch on gas because we've connected most of the households in the UK, far higher than any other European country in terms of our gas connectivity. So that means and gas is such a cheap fuel at the moment, it's very difficult to compete with. So we're going to have to do a lot of work to basically make this technology much more attractive going forwards. And I think we're beginning to see it come through. It already exists as a capability, but it now needs government to make sure it supports it and devolves it going forward.
Because I think the government have decreed that there won't be any new houses built with gas energy supply from within about 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, they should do it now, really.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason they shouldn't do it now, but I suspect there's probably a load of plans already in place that they can't really turn off. But it's basically the gas pipeline network companies make a lot of money out of it.
Yeah.
So again, you've got somebody who's trying to stop. They don't want that to be an asset that is stranded, that's left behind. So they're desperately trying to figure out what do they do with this gas pipeline once they stop supplying gas to everybody through it.
Yeah. So as a final question, do you think we're going to hit our targets in being completely carbon free in this country, maybe in other parts of the world by 2050? And as a supplement to that, is that soon enough?
So I think one of the first things we've done is made it a legally binding commitment to hit the 2050 target. That has been incredibly important in shifting the behaviour of the industry. So previously we had, I think, an 80% reduction. And you can't believe how many people thought they were going to be in the 20% that didn't have to reduce. Now that 20%'s been removed, everybody's now trying to think about how do we hit this 2050 target. Now the numbers, some of the projections I've seen so far show that there's some important technologies that need to come through and kind of save us, things like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. My personal view is I think we need to be more ambitious with the existing technologies we have and push them harder and faster. But I do believe we can do it. I think we've seen, something like the Climate Change Committee as forecast basically say something like 60% of the actions need to be partially technology driven, partially behavioural change driven. Now what we've seen in COVID has been a fascinating example of where you can see massive behavioural change over a very short period of time. And I think we need to harness that and really think about how can we get behavioural change working together with technological change to accelerate this and deliver that 2050 target. And do I think it should be earlier? I mean, I think it should be earlier because otherwise we've got nothing in the bank. What always worries me is if we're going for 2050 and that's the furthest out we can get, if we miss it, then that's a real problem. Bringing it forward just makes it more ambitious and also makes people start to think about change now rather than tomorrow. And that's a big mindset change for the industry as a whole and for government.
It's interesting because you mentioned the pandemic there, and in the pandemic we've seen this massive decrease in flying.
Yeah.
And people don't really want to make sacrifices, do they? I mean, most people will sort of say, I believe that we should avoid climate change, but many of us like jumping on a plane and going somewhere. Yeah. Do you think it will be down to people having to make those sacrifices, or do you think the industry will start coming up with solutions and we'll start seeing electric planes in the near future?
I think this is where, for me, something like the aerospace industry, I think that we are looking at electric planes and seeing what the potential is on that. But that is where something like a carbon capture and storage technology is important. Those hard to reach areas Whereas something simple like heat or something simple like electricity generation, we shouldn't be wasting that technology in those areas. We should be using it on the hard to treat.
Juliet Davenport, thank you very much for coming. Very much enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being here today. What a fantastic environment to be in.
Thank you.